They thought I was asleep when they said it, not whispered, not hinted, not softened by guilt or fear. They said it clearly, calmly, like people discussing tomorrow's weather or a delayed flight. Once she's gone, everything finally becomes ours. I didn't open my eyes. I didn't flinch. I didn't make a sound. In that moment, as machines breathed for me and the sterile hospital light burned above my head, I understood something so horrifying it froze my blood in my veins. My family wasn't waiting for my death. They were planning it. And instead of stopping them, instead of screaming or exposing them, I made a choice that would change everything. I decided to let them finish the plan. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and for most of my 62 years, I believed I had built a good life. Not a perfect one, not an easy one, but an honest one. I was widowed at 42, left with 2 children and a mountain of responsibility that never cared about grief. I worked until exhaustion became normal, until pain became background noise, until survival felt like a profession. I built my wealth slowly, carefully, one decision at a time. Real estate, contracts, investments that required patience and discipline. No inheritance, no shortcuts, just years of sacrifice that people later called success. My children called me strict, others called me formidable. I thought love meant providing security, even when it cost warmth. I thought loyalty was permanent. I trusted my family. That trust was my greatest vulnerability. The accident happened on a night soaked in rain. The road was slick, headlights blurred into white streaks, and then there was the sound of metal tearing itself apart. When I woke up, the ceiling was white and unfamiliar, machines humming like mechanical guardians. The doctor told me I was lucky. Multiple fractures, internal injuries, a long recovery ahead, but nothing terminal. Painful, yes. Dangerous, yes. But survivable. At least, that was the truth. My children arrived hours later. Daniel, my eldest, composed and controlled as always. Claire, my youngest, gentle and soft-spoken, her emotions carefully measured. They cried when they saw me, or at least they performed the shape of grief convincingly enough that most people would never question it. Most people didn't know them the way I did. Daniel stood at the foot of my bed, not close enough to touch me, not far enough to seem distant. Claire held my hand, but her grip was loose, fleeting, as if staying too long might contaminate her. Daniel asked the doctor how bad it was, not whether I would recover, not whether I would be okay, just how bad. The doctor hesitated, and in that pause I noticed something I couldn't unsee. Daniel leaned forward. Claire stopped breathing for half a second. It wasn't fear in their eyes, it was anticipation. Later that night, after visiting hours ended, Dr. Miles returned alone. He closed the door softly and spoke in a voice stripped of professional distance. He had been my doctor for over 20 years. He treated my husband. He watched my children grow up. He told me my children ask questions no grieving family should ask. Questions about assets, authority, timing. He told me he could adjust what they heard if I wanted time, clarity, control. I stared at the ceiling for a long moment before whispering, yes. That quiet word saved my life. The next morning, Dr. Miles delivered a different version of reality. In front of Daniel and Claire, he explained that complications were arising, that my organs were failing, that my body was shutting down. He said I had 3 days left to live. Claire collapsed into a chair. Her sobs delayed just enough to feel rehearsed. Daniel closed his eyes, exhaled, and smiled. Not openly, not boldly, just enough. Enough for me to see. Enough to confirm everything I feared. They thought I was sedated when they spoke. They believed the machines had replaced my awareness. Daniel leaned closer and whispered, "Finally." Claire laughed quietly and said she had been afraid it would take longer. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I feared the monitors would betray me. Daniel said there would be no more waiting, no more pretending. Claire squeezed his arm and said they would finally be free, free from me. They didn't leave right away. They talked. They talked about my properties, my accounts, my jewelry, my life's work, as if it were inventory after a liquidation sale. Daniel had numbers prepared. Claire asked if the process could be accelerated. Daniel said he knew someone who worked nights, someone who could help, someone who could make sure things ended quickly. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I memorized everything. That night, alone in the hospital room, I made my decision. I wouldn't confront them. I wouldn't warn them. I wouldn't stop them. I would let them believe they were winning, because people who think they've already won become careless. They speak freely. They expose themselves. And those 3 days they thought were my countdown were never about my death. They were about theirs. By the morning of the first day they believed was my last, I had already begun dying for them. Not physically, not truly, but convincingly enough that hope quietly packed its bags and left their faces. Nurses were instructed to speak in hushed tones when Daniel and Claire entered the room. Charts were angled away. Conversations were cut short. Dr. Miles played his role with devastating precision, letting just enough uncertainty seep into his words to feel authentic. My breathing was labored on purpose, my movements minimal, my eyes mostly closed. I learned quickly that people reveal far more when they think you can no longer hear them. Claire brushed my hair with trembling hands when others were watching, but the moment the door closed behind the nurse, her touch vanished. Daniel stood near the window, checking his phone, making calls he never took in front of me before. I listened to everything, every careless word, every whispered calculation, and I stored them like ammunition. On the afternoon of that first day, they brought documents. Not flowers, not prayers, not memories. Documents. Daniel placed them on the small table near my bed and spoke softly, the way people do when they want to sound compassionate without feeling it. He said it was just in case, just to make things easier, just to ensure my wishes were respected. Power of attorney, temporary guardianship clauses, emergency asset access. I didn't open my eyes, but my heart thudded so loudly, I wondered how he couldn't hear it. Claire nodded beside him, adding that it was all for my peace of mind. Peace. As if death were an administrative inconvenience. As if my life had already been reduced to signatures and transfers. They didn't know that every document they slid forward was being photographed later by a nurse whose loyalty had been purchased with kindness years earlier. They didn't know Dr. Miles had alerted a legal colleague of mine, a woman named Judith, who specialized in quiet wars fought with paperwork and patience. Judith arrived that night, not as a lawyer, but as an old friend, carrying soup and sorrow. She leaned close, kissed my forehead, and whispered that everything was being recorded, logged, preserved. Every attempt, every word, every move. I remained still, my role unbroken, my performance flawless. That evening, the tone shifted. Daniel grew bolder. He spoke about timelines without lowering his voice as much. He asked the nurse how quickly the body usually declined once organs began to fail. He asked whether pain medication could be increased to keep her comfortable. Claire watched him carefully, as if gauging how far he was willing to go, how much darkness he was ready to reveal. When they were alone again, she asked if he was sure about the man he mentioned, the one who worked nights, the one who could help. Daniel told her not to worry. He said everything was already arranged. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, not fear, but clarity. They weren't just waiting, they were moving. Late that night, Someone unfamiliar entered my room. He wore hospital scrubs, but his posture was wrong, his eyes too alert, too assessing. He checked my IV, adjusted the drip, and lingered longer than necessary. I kept my breathing shallow, my eyelids heavy. He muttered something about dosage under his breath and left. Within minutes, Dr. Miles returned, furious in a way I had never seen before. The IV was removed, replaced, and secured. He told me quietly that the man Daniel had hired had acted sooner than expected. He told me that if I hadn't been pretending, if I hadn't been monitored, if we hadn't anticipated the move, I might already be dead. The truth settled over me like a weight. My children had crossed a line there was no return from. The second day arrived heavy with inevitability. Word spread through the family. Cousins called, distant relatives arrived with solemn faces and rehearsed condolences. Daniel and Claire performed grief beautifully. They held hands, they whispered, they accepted embraces. I watched them through half-lidded eyes and wondered when exactly my children learned to mourn someone who was still alive. Judith returned, this time with more urgency. She told me authorities had been quietly informed. Not arrests, not yet. Observation, documentation, patience. She told me I was doing well, that surviving this kind of betrayal without breaking required a strength most people never discovered. I didn't feel strong. I felt hollow, like something essential had already been buried. That afternoon, Daniel leaned close to my ear. His voice was gentle, almost affectionate. He told me it was okay to let go. He said I had done enough. He said he and Claire would take care of everything. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab his wrist and ask when I had become an obstacle instead of a mother. But I stayed still. Because I needed him to believe. Claire stood at the foot of the bed, watching us, her eyes glossy. For a moment, I thought I saw doubt flicker across her face. For a moment, I almost hoped. Then she spoke, and the illusion shattered. She asked if the medication could be increased again, just to be safe. That night, the man returned. This time he didn't hide his intent. He stood too close, his hand steady as he reached for the IV. Before he could touch it, the door opened. Security, police, Dr. Miles. The room filled with movement and authority. The man froze. He was escorted out without a word. Daniel and Claire arrived moments later, their faces pale with manufactured confusion. Daniel demanded explanations. Claire cried. Dr. Miles explained that there had been an attempt to administer an unauthorized substance, that the hospital had protocols, that law enforcement would handle it. I watched my children unravel in silence. Daniel's jaw tightened. Claire's hands trembled. They knew. They knew this was no longer under their control. The third day dawned quietly. Too quietly. I was moved to another room under the pretense of deterioration. Daniel and Claire were informed that I had slipped into unconsciousness. They were told it was only a matter of hours. They sat beside me, whispering plans they thought no one could hear. Daniel spoke about selling the coastal property first. Claire talked about renovations. They spoke about freedom again, about starting fresh, about finally living. I felt something inside me harden, not into anger, but into resolve. These were not children who had made mistakes. These were adults who had made choices. When the door opened that final time, it wasn't a nurse who entered. It was Judith. It was Dr. Miles. It was two detectives. Daniel stood abruptly. Claire gasped. Confusion filled the room like smoke. Dr. Miles spoke calmly. He explained that my condition had stabilized, that the deception was intentional, that everything they had said and done over the past 3 days had been documented, recorded, witnessed. The detective stepped forward. Daniel protested. Claire cried. I opened my eyes. The sound Claire made when she realized I was looking directly at her will haunt me forever. Shock, fear, recognition. Daniel backed away as if I were something resurrected. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply said their names. And in that moment, whatever illusion they had clung to collapsed completely. They tried to speak. I raised my hand. I told them I had heard everything. I told them I had let them continue because I needed to know how far they would go. I told them they had answered that question fully. As they were escorted out, Daniel turned and said I had done this to them, that I had forced their hand. Claire sobbed that she never meant for it to go so far. I watched them leave, my heart breaking in a way no surgery ever could. I didn't feel victorious. I felt final, because whatever they had been to me before those 3 days no longer existed. And as the room emptied, as silence returned, I understood something with brutal clarity. Letting them finish the plan hadn't just saved my life. It had ended a lie I had lived inside for decades. In part 3, the world would learn what my children were willing to do for money, and I would learn who I was without them. After they were taken away, the room felt unnaturally quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of machines that had become witnesses to the ugliest truth of my life. Dr. Miles asked if I was all right, but the question felt absurd. How does someone answer that after discovering the people they gave life to had tried to take theirs? I wasn't all right. I wasn't broken either. I was something colder, something reshaped. A woman who had finally seen clearly, and clarity, I learned, hurts more than any lie. The days that followed passed in a strange blur. I was moved to a private recovery suite under police protection. Nurses rotated quietly, their eyes full of sympathy they didn't dare express out loud. Detectives visited daily, asking me to repeat details I wished I could forget. What did Daniel say exactly? How often did Claire mention timing? Did they ever express doubt? I answered everything calmly, methodically, as if recounting someone else's tragedy. Somewhere along the way, emotion had shut itself off, like a circuit breaker flipping to prevent a greater fire. The betrayal was too vast to feel all at once. News travels fast when money is involved. By the end of the week, whispers had escaped the hospital. By the second week, they became headlines. A respected businesswoman, a staged death, children accused of plotting murder for inheritance. Cameras gathered outside the hospital entrance, hungry and relentless. I refused interviews. I owed the public nothing. The truth would come out without my performance. Judith handled everything, issuing brief statements that said more by saying less. Evidence was mounting, she told me. Phone records, financial trails, messages Daniel thought he had deleted. The man they hired to finish what they started had already agreed to cooperate fully. Fear, it turns out, makes people honest. When I was finally discharged, I didn't go home. I couldn't. That house had already been mentally divided, sold, stripped of meaning. Instead, I stayed with my brother Thomas, the only family member who hadn't treated my life like an asset. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer platitudes. He simply made tea and sat nearby, grounding me in a world that still contained decency. At night, when sleep refused to come, I stared at the dark ceiling and replayed memories of Daniel and Claire as children. First steps, school plays, late-night fevers. I wondered when love had quietly turned into entitlement, when gratitude had curdled into resentment. I wondered if I'd missed the moment it all went wrong, or if it had been happening all along beneath my certainty. The arrest warrants came quickly: conspiracy to commit murder, attempted homicide, fraud, financial abuse, charges that sounded unreal when paired with the names I once whispered with affection. Daniel's lawyer called Judith, proposing silence, proposing negotiation, proposing anything that might soften what was coming. Judith declined on my behalf, without hesitation. There are lines that, once crossed, erase the possibility of compromise. Claire's attorney tried a different approach: remorse, tears, claims of manipulation, claims of fear, claims that she never truly believed I would die. I listened to the recordings later. I heard her voice asking how fast things could be wrapped up. I felt nothing. Lies sound hollow once you've heard the truth. The court hearings began in early autumn. I attended the first one quietly, sitting behind Daniel and Claire, close enough to see the tension in their shoulders. Daniel avoided turning around. Claire looked back once, her eyes red, searching my face for something. Mercy. Confirmation. Permission to believe this was all a misunderstanding. I gave her nothing. The judge reviewed the evidence without expression, his voice steady as he denied bail. Too much planning, too much intent, too much money already moved into hidden accounts. Daniel's composure cracked for the first time when the gavel fell. Claire began to cry openly, the sound sharp and desperate. I stayed seated until they were led away. Standing felt unnecessary. Nothing in me needed to prove strength anymore. What surprised me most was not the trial itself, but the aftermath of visibility. Letters arrived by the dozens. Strangers writing about their own families, their own betrayals, their own fears of becoming expendable once they stopped being useful. Women my age wrote that they felt seen, that they had spent their lives being resources instead of people, that they feared growing old not because of death, but because of irrelevance. I read every letter, slowly, painfully. I realized my story was not rare. It was simply rarely exposed. Daniel tried to contact me from jail, at first through lawyers, then through letters written in careful handwriting meant to appear reflective. He blamed pressure. He blamed debt. He blamed fear of losing control. He blamed me, subtly, for being too strong, too distant, too commanding. Claire wrote differently. Her letters were emotional, spiraling, apologetic in tone, but vague in responsibility. She said she never wanted me dead, only gone. As if that distinction mattered. As if erasing someone's existence were somehow more forgivable than ending it outright. I didn't respond to either of them. Silence, I learned, is not cruelty, it is boundary. As the trial date approached, the prosecution laid out their case with surgical precision. Timelines were reconstructed, conversations played aloud in court. Hearing Daniel's voice discussing my death in such practical terms felt like listening to a stranger wear my son's face. Claire's laughter in one recording made several jurors look away. The man they hired testified in exchange for leniency, his voice shaking as he admitted he had been paid in advance. The courtroom was full every day. No one wanted to miss a story that confirmed the darkest suspicion people carry quietly about love and money. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand slowly, deliberately. I didn't look at Daniel. I didn't look at Claire. I spoke only to the truth. I described the hospital room, the words they thought I couldn't hear, the decision to pretend, not out of revenge, but out of survival. I told the court that I had loved my children without condition, but that unconditional love did not include permission to destroy me. The courtroom was silent when I finished. Even the judge paused before speaking, as if weighing something heavier than law. The verdict came faster than anyone expected, guilty on all major counts. Gasps rippled through the room. Claire collapsed into her chair. Daniel stared straight ahead, unmoving, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might shatter. I felt no relief, no satisfaction, only an immense, aching finality. Justice, I learned, does not heal. It only closes doors. Afterward, as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, I walked past them all without stopping. I had nothing left to explain. That chapter was written in bloodless ink, but it was finished. What remained was the rest of my life, stripped of illusion, stripped of denial. In part 4, I would have to face the hardest truth of all. Surviving betrayal is one thing. Learning how to live after it is another entirely. The sentencing day arrived like a thunderclap, a moment I had imagined in nightmares and daydreams with equal intensity. The courthouse felt smaller than I remembered, crowded with journalists, law enforcement, and a scattering of faces I recognized from earlier hearings. Daniel and Claire were led in separately, their expressions hollow, their former arrogance replaced by a weight they could no longer deflect. When the judge called the courtroom to order, the air became electric, charged with anticipation and something darker, a collective recognition of the betrayal that had unfolded over years. I took my seat, not in triumph, but in quiet endurance. This day wasn't about me winning or them losing. It was about facing reality and letting consequences speak louder than words. As the judge read each charge and its corresponding sentence, I felt the world contract and expand simultaneously. Daniel received 20 years for conspiracy to commit murder, with additional consecutive sentences for fraud, theft, and forgery. Claire's sentence was reduced due to her cooperation, yet still significant, reminding the world that manipulation and guilt do not erase responsibility. The gavel fell, echoing in the room like a judgment not just of law, but of morality. Daniel lowered his head, his face unreadable, while Claire's tears were bitter and relentless. I did not feel elation. I did not feel vindication. I felt an emptiness, a strange mixture of grief and liberation. I had survived their plan. I had survived their deceit. But I had also survived a child I could no longer recognize as my own. Walking out of the courtroom afterward, I was greeted by friends, lawyers, and strangers whose empathy had carried them through my story. Thomas held my hand tightly, a silent pillar of comfort. Judith's eyes were proud but tired. Reporters swarmed, microphones extended, questions shouted, cameras flashing like lightning. I paused for a moment, allowing myself to meet the gaze of the public, not as a victim, but as a survivor. I told them my story, not for fame, not for pity, but for awareness. Betrayal can hide behind familiar faces, I said. It can thrive in silence, in secrecy, and in greed. But surviving it requires courage, boundaries, and a refusal to die a victim. The words felt like fire leaving my lips, burning away some of the lingering shadows of despair. In the weeks that followed, I focused on what remained: my grandchildren, my friends, my life. The Harrison Foundation opened its doors, a sanctuary and a beacon for those trapped by addiction, deceit, and financial ruin. It was more than a memorial of what was taken from me. It was a reclamation of purpose, a statement that pain can be transformed into power, that suffering can be converted into salvation for others. I watched as families sought counseling, as young adults learned to escape the spiral of gambling and manipulation, as lives were quietly rebuilt. With each story of recovery, I felt a fraction of the unbearable weight lift from my shoulders. The money, once a symbol of greed and betrayal, became a tool for healing, a weapon against the darkness that had nearly destroyed my family. Even now, years later, I receive letters from strangers and survivors, sharing their own struggles, their own brushes with betrayal. Some ask how I survived. Some ask how I found strength to testify against my own children. I tell them the truth. It is not easy, and it is not instantaneous. But it begins with refusing to be a victim, with reclaiming your story, with transforming pain into purpose. Forgiveness may or may not come. It is not required, but survival, dignity, and action are. My story is proof that betrayal can be exposed, justice can be served, and life can still be rebuilt in the aftermath. To everyone watching this, if you've been captivated, shocked, or moved by this story, take a moment to reflect. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, comment with your thoughts or experiences, and don't forget to like this video. Every interaction helps ensure that this story reaches those who may feel trapped, unheard, or betrayed. You may never know whose life you might change simply by spreading awareness. And if you take anything from my journey, let it be this: your life, your dignity, and your purpose are yours alone. Never allow anyone to steal them, and never let your pain go to waste. Years have passed since that harrowing day when I sat in the courtroom, watching the children I raised as my own be condemned for crimes so cold, so calculated, that they shattered every illusion of family I once believed in. Time, they say, heals all wounds, but it doesn't erase them. What it does is give you space to rebuild, to reclaim fragments of yourself that were almost stolen. I've spent those years not seeking revenge, but seeking purpose. Every lecture I give, every counseling session I oversee at the Harrison Foundation, every story I share with someone teetering on the edge of financial ruin or addiction, feels like a thread weaving back the tapestry of life that greed and betrayal tried to tear apart. I have learned that survival is not merely existing, it is transforming every ounce of pain into action, every tear into fuel, every fear into resolve. Sometimes, late at night, I still think of Daniel and Claire. Not with hatred, for that emotion corrodes the soul, but with a sober acknowledgement of the depths to which humans can fall. I think of the son who smiled at my death, who counted my life in dollars and accounts, and I am reminded of the fragility of trust, the dangerous seduction of greed, and the importance of vigilance, no matter how familiar the face before you may seem. My grandchildren, now growing with a sense of love and security I fought desperately to preserve, are proof that life continues beyond betrayal, beyond despair. They remind me that the bonds of family are not only inherited, they are nurtured, protected, and sometimes fiercely defended against the ones who would seek to harm them. And yet, I am not defined by the crimes of my children. I am defined by the courage it took to stand, the clarity it took to act, and the compassion it took to redirect my story into something larger than myself. The foundation thrives, the programs expand, and thousands of families have been saved from the same traps that ensnared mine. Every time someone calls or writes to say that the foundation prevented a marriage from crumbling, stopped a person from losing their home, or rescued a young gambler from ruin, I feel the power of transformation. It is a quiet, profound, and unshakable victory, far greater than any courtroom verdict or financial recovery. I share this final part of my story with you, not for applause, not for sympathy, but for awareness. Life can be cruel, and betrayal can come from the hands you once held. But it can also be reclaimed, reshaped, and redirected. You can survive what seems impossible. You can find peace when it feels unreachable. You can transform what was meant to destroy you into something that saves others. And if you are sitting there, wounded by someone you love, remember this: the power to turn pain into purpose rests entirely within you. Your story is not over until you choose to write the final chapter. Before you leave this video, I ask you to do something simple but powerful. Like this video if it moved you, share it with someone who needs hope, and leave a comment with your thoughts, your story, or even just a word of encouragement. Your engagement could be the spark that changes a life, that prevents another betrayal from consuming a family, that lights a path for someone walking through darkness. Every click, every share, every word matters. My life was nearly destroyed, but I chose purpose. You can choose it too. And when you do, the world will be brighter because of your courage, your resilience, and your refusal to be a victim.